At this point in our story, many students of Latin American political history are tempted to fixate on the new socialist and populist mass parties that emerged during the early 20th century. While others are eager to skip ahead to the middle of the century, when even more powerful mass political forces are finally going to take the stage. Accounts of 20th century Latin American politics tend to overlook the older elite parties altogether, or they dismiss these traditional parties as mere relics of a bygone era and symbols of the corrupt old order that the newer political parties are reacting against. This is a rather unfortunate view, because many of these older parties are going through major organizational and ideological transformations during the early 20th century. And these transformations are every bit as important for the trajectory of Latin American politics as the emergence of new political forces. Latin American elite parties have always relied on mass support, but by the turn of the century, these mass supporters are becoming more assertive and less willing to allow the traditional party elites to continue dictating the party's destiny. At the same time, many of these parties are developing organizational structures that fully integrate lower-class citizens into the party organization and grant low-level party activists a truly unprecedented role in party decisions. Many small-s socialists in the region are going to take note of these transformations. Some of them will make a strategic decision to forego building new socialist parties of their own, and they will instead organize within the traditional parties in an attempt to push them to the left. By the middle of the 20th century, the party organizations of the major traditional parties will become a key site of class conflict in Latin America. By this point, these parties have ceased to be simple representatives of upper-class interests. Their policy platforms, their composition and identities, their very hearts and souls are now contested by newly enfranchised actors who seek to use these historic party organizations to pursue their own political goals. We have already seen the early stages of these transformations in the radical parties of Argentina and Chile during the final decades of the 19th century. Similar transformations will soon take place in other elite parties throughout the region, including the Colorado and National parties of Uruguay, the liberal and conservative parties of Colombia, and to a lesser extent, the liberal and national parties of Honduras. These traditional parties incorporated the middle and lower classes first and foremost out of a drive for self-preservation. Over the long run, mass-based political parties perform better in elections compared to the cadre parties and political machines of earlier decades. And a traditional party that has acquired a large and stable mass base is more likely to withstand the entry of new socialist and populist parties into the political arena. Some of the region's elite parties will attempt to attract popular support by enacting progressive social and economic reforms from the top down that are designed to ingratiate the party with the masses while undercutting the anarchist and socialist movements. Many of these same parties will also work to mobilize middle-class and lower-class activists into the party organization itself in a way that integrates them into the internal life of the party and encourages them to form a psychological and emotional bond to that party. We have already seen several parties adopt structures that make the party leadership and candidates at least nominally accountable to the party convention, which is comprised of the representatives of local party branches. By the early 20th century, the men and women who filled the conventions and local branches of Latin American traditional parties are relatively low-level activists from middle class and working class backgrounds. The party's nominally democratic structure helps the activists develop a permanent stake in the party. When party activists believe that they have a meaningful voice in party decisions, they are less likely to switch to one of the newer, more populist parties that may be a closer fit for their own ideological preferences. However, these structures pose an inherent risk for the traditional elites of these parties. The old landowners and businessmen who dominated these parties in the past often have very different political views and preferences compared to the newer and less affluent activists who are now organizing within these parties. The activists tend to be much more left-wing on economic issues in particular. The more influence that these activists gain within the party organization, the more likely they are to push the party in directions that the old elites do not want to go. This risk becomes all the more acute as these countries democratize during the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, and millions of new voters enter the electorate for the first time. As more newly enfranchised voters join these parties, a party organization that starts out evenly balanced between the elites and activists may see the influence of the activists grow to the point that the activists now control the party's agenda. The activists will try to use the party to advance populist policies that are against the interests of the party's upper-class leaders. Later on in this series, we will see some activists seize control over the party organization, displacing or even expelling the party's traditional elite. These takeover attempts are still a long way off, but they are possible in large part due to the organizational openings that occur within these parties at the start of the 20th century. The next 4 videos are going to focus on 2 parties that should already be familiar to any viewer who has made it this far in this series. We will begin with the Colorado Party of Uruguay, where a reformist president is going to try to mobilize mass support by enacting the most progressive policy agenda that any Latin American country had seen up until that point. These top-down economic and social reforms are going to spark a fierce backlash from the right wing of his party that will ultimately rip the party apart and marginalize this leader from power. In an attempt to win back power, this leader is going to end up democratizing the rump of the party that he still controls, and these changes will have the effect of revitalizing his party and transforming it into the leading force for progressive political change in mid-20th century Uruguay. Then we are going to take a second look at the Radical Party of Chile. We already saw this party democratize its internal structure in an earlier video. And now we are going to see some of the long-term consequences of these organizational reforms. We will watch as socialist and anarchist activists organize within the Radical Party in an attempt to reorient it towards the working class. And to the horror of the Radical Party's old guard elite, these activists are going to succeed at pushing their party to the left on economic issues by the 1930s. Ideologically speaking, the Colorado and Radical parties will end up at a very similar place, but they will get there by different paths. While the Colorado Party repositions itself on the left through top-down reforms, the Radical Party drifts to the left through a more bottom-up process in which the party's assembly activists use the new institutional tools at their disposal to pull their party closer to their own ideological viewpoint. From there, we will turn our attention to the ways that activists of both parties organize at the neighborhood level, And we will examine how this party activism affects the broader power dynamics within the party organization as a whole. Then we will examine how these parties respond to the rise of the women's suffrage movement in the early 20th century. This will offer us a useful case study of the ways that new movements and activists work inside these traditional parties in an attempt to place new issues onto their political agendas. These two parties serve as good illustrations of the sorts of issues and challenges that many elite parties in Latin America are confronting as their countries transition from competitive oligarchies into mass democracies. But I want to be clear that not every elite party in the region ends up going nearly as far as the Colorado and radical parties do. Latin American elite parties tend to build a durable mass base only in political systems that are simultaneously competitive and fairly stable. Competitive in the sense that opposition parties have a realistic chance of winning an election someday, and stable in the sense that the same parties are sticking around from election to election. Without this competition and stability, the risks that mass incorporation pose to the party's traditional elites far outweigh the benefits. In order to get a well-rounded picture of how Latin American elite parties are organizing during the early decades of the 20th century, we are also going to examine two negative cases where elites chose not to incorporate the masses into their parties. The first of these cases will be Costa Rica, which has one of the most competitive political systems in Latin America by this point, but where the party system is so unstable that no political leaders see any advantage in making a long-term investment like mass incorporation. Then we will return to Brazil and we will examine the much harsher political system that has developed there since the monarchy was overthrown. Brazil's old republic is governed by a series of regional political machines that monopolize electoral politics within their respective states through a mixture of patronage and political violence. And this leaves no room for the sort of mass participation and party activism that are already becoming increasingly common in other parts of Latin America by the early 20th century.